I have two unlikely books which we're using together. We're using Thomas Jefferson's book, which is actually his selection from the New Testament, weeding out all of the material that he felt had been settled upon by doctrinaire meetings throughout the centuries. And it's known as Jefferson's Bible, and there's a new edition in a little hardcover, just simply called Jefferson's Bible, and you can get that. I was using the Princeton University Press edition, but it's so expensive, and even in paperback, I think it's somewhere around $20. But I believe Jefferson's Bible is somewhere around $9. So you can use this if you want to. I am coupling with Jefferson's Bible the most esoteric book of the 20th century, W.B. Yates's book, A Vision. Now, Yates and Jefferson, to most people, do not go together. And I won't stretch things by making a case that they were both revolutionaries. But they were. But I would like to make this kind of an introduction so that you can understand and appreciate why it is that at this particular juncture I use Yates and Jefferson together. We're integrating. The question is, what are we integrating? And the popular answer is we're integrating psychic energy. Psychic energy. In terms of traditional education, what we are integrating is most aptly called, and I'm going to use the ascription which John Dewey used. We are integrating a field of inquiry. A field of inquiry. Whatever it is that we have looked at has drawn our attention. This, in suspension, is the field of inquiry. And Dewey's pragmatic theory of logic is that logic is a procedure which allows us to explore the field of inquiry no matter what it is, no matter what form it is, no matter who we are, no matter what our antecedents. That by simply using some kind of rote, categorical, dicing up technique of a standardized instruction parading as education, gives one back standardized people. Gandhi once said that British Empire education was suited to making clerks in a worldwide bureaucracy. Our tact is that our education is a universally malleable experience that is specifically tailored to your individuality. That this education works in such a way that it causes sneezes the world around. Everyone has the same allergy. We don't like to be caught short ignorantly. And so this education gives us an opportunity to have a universal field of inquiry, but from a specifically personal standpoint. You may choose, and you do choose, to have your attention alerted by whatever selectivity you care to. You've been in this long enough and you know that I'm not lazy. I don't do lots of things because I can't do them, but it's a selection on my part to allow you complete freedom, complete mobility, to make whatever selection you choose to have for yourself. I don't give you any model other than the totality of the course. I don't expect you to take the entire course. Someone who really took this in its entirety, it would have explosive results. You simply would become dissatisfied with your work, and there would be a revolution and everything. I know it happened to me. I was one time very, very pleasantly employed in a very large corporation in San Francisco, making very nice money. And at 23, I thought I was fixed. And then I learned how to learn, and I became unhappy and poor. I'm still very poor, but I'm learning to be happy. That's 30 years. They don't invite me to any board meetings. This education, then, is a field of inquiry. And my purpose is to enrich that field of inquiry, and that our integration, then, we're integrating the field of inquiry, which is generated from the material that I provide, but it's also your psychic energy. So we have two different cycles that are coming together. We have your psychic energy, which is integrating, and my field of inquiry, which is integrating. The crisscross between those two cycles will always be individual. And because I weight your psychic energy more than my material, I never insist that you must read this, you must do that. I invite you and leave it at that. I do not look even at your various projects. I leave myself completely outside of that. So as to weight your psychic energy cycle heavier than my field of inquiry material. Now we're going to see today that when you have two or more cycles like that, the resultant is a sphere of actuality, which has a very characteristic way of integrating and of allowing later on, retrospectively, for analysis. Any other way creates a freeze-dried type of personality, usually a follower of the person who controls the education. And it doesn't matter whether it's the church or the state or the charismatic individual or whatever it is. The same product is a freeze-dried bureaucracy of simplified intent. I don't care for this. People like Jefferson didn't care for this. I think he still doesn't care for it. Yates certainly rebelled against it all his life. So what we're doing here with Yates and Jefferson, this is the culmination of integration. This is bringing together the field of inquiry which I have generated, but also allowing for your cycle of psychic energy integration to take the lead. Now, I want to give you some material, and these notes, incidentally, we can make copies of for anybody who wants them. Let me just give you this information, and then I'll get to our exemplary literature. These are some powerful ideas. We've come far enough in our education now that we can have ideas. The first powerful idea, the integration or the integrating psyche. The integrating psyche requires an integration nexus for the field of inquiry. This means to say when you're pulling together, you have to have a center. That's what it says. If you're going to pull something together, you're going to have a center. The integrating nexus. It's not that the nexus needs to be there in and of itself. It's that if the psyche is in the process of bringing together, there will be a center whether you want it to have one or not. So it is a powerful idea to understand that you can nominate the center that you want to, and it will at least provisionally serve as the center. You may have to change it later on in retrospect. If you do not yourself nominate an integrating nexus, one will automatically come out of the psyche. That is to say, instinct will take over, habit will take over, conditioning will take over, the society, the political education, the religious upbringing, whatever it is that is strongest in you, will project the center out for you. And in which case it will not be you that appears, but a mask of you. And we will see that one of the strongest esoteric elements in Yates's mystical thought is the mask. And how the mask, once it is filled with our energy, becomes a tyrant against our potential real person. And that the mask, Yates's mask, is esoterically what normal psychology calls the ego. And that if we do not come together in terms of our actual self, our real self, this ego possibility of a variant of ourselves, according to whatever the strongest conditioning is, will take over. And the only way to stop that is to refuse to go any further with the integration process. And most of the people that you run across who are in a kind of a limbo, a rut kind of life, are people who are purposely spinning their wheels because they cannot integrate any further without feeding energy to an ego which they know they don't want to be. So one gets caught in between the devil and the deep blue sea. It's a famously disastrous position which intelligent men and women have found themselves in time after time. The last 7,000 or 8,000 years of civilization have just shown us again and again the exacerbation of this process. That people just go so far and they begin to spin their wheels unconsciously on purpose. They do not hear, they do not see. They sabotage any attempt for themselves to learn. As Jung points out several times in his last essays, he noticed after 10,000, 20,000 patients in therapy, there always is a standpoint of hiatus that is reached in any therapy, in any growth, in any personal development, a kind of a self-sabotage, because we begin to be suspicious about knowing more, about learning something different, about encountering something new. Because the differentness, the newness, the growth is viewed as an unknown. And that unknown has a potentiality of X versus the known, which is our inability to even handle the energy we already have called forth. And so we fear. We fight or flight from that unknown. And in fact, existentially, the name of that particular emotion, when one gets deep enough and brings it out raw and whole, the name of that emotion is dread. Dread. So that one gets into a radical bind that to know one more thing is the most dreadful thing in the world. And this, of course, because no one can long stand that pure raw dread, it becomes distributed throughout the psychic energy as a kind of a self-sabotaging, not paying attention to elements that would contribute towards learning something new, exploring the unknown, developing for real, integrating deeper. The technique that Jung pioneered in his therapy was at that point to put a mask upon that negative feeling and call it the shadow. It's not you that is fearful, it's the shadow that is fearful, and you can deal with that shadow. When in actual practice, in actual fact, it is ourselves. There's no devil worse than ourselves in a condition of fearfulness flying from our own self-development. So the integrating psyche requires an integration nexus for the field of inquiry. One way to keep this center in an operative locale so that it can really do its stuff, to keep the center centered, is to have a synthesizing symbol. You can think of a synthesizing symbol as the axis of the spinning center. Whatever keeps the center balanced, that's the synthesizing symbol. A synthesizing symbol satisfies this requirement. Note here, the ego is an unsatisfactory answer to this, though it constantly tries recommending itself tirelessly. Me. You need a honcho? I'm you. It finally goes down to this power play where it says, well, how could you get along without me? I am you. It's this non sequitur logical dead end that A is A. And that's logically fallacious on many counts. Many counts. The symbol then, the synthesizing symbol, has several specific capacities which we've talked about, and now we'll bring them together because we're talking about the idea of the synthesizing symbol, which then allows for integration to proceed. The symbol includes Cardinal Series threads. Cardinal Series threads. And in order not to misunderstand, not to think of little like superstrings in the psyche or something, the traditional ascription of these Cardinal Series alignments, they're referred to, and I'm going to use Kandinsky, Wassily Kandinsky, one of the great artists of the early 20th century. He wrote a little book called Concerning the Spiritual and Art, which we will use later on. And then because no one understood it, he wrote a larger book, about twice as big, to explain it, and it was called From Point to Line to Plane, because Kandinsky was very masterful. All you have to do is look at a photograph of the mature Kandinsky, and you see, hands down, he's like Yates, is an absolutely masterful human being. Point to line to plane is the way in which the reality of a geometry comes into play. And the psyche, psychic energy, up to a certain point is controlled by this geometric quality. Point to line to plane. The Cardinal Series is like the points that are aligned. The ordinal series is like the lines being. Just think of like the depth of a swimming pool, and there are various lines showing the growth of the water pressure in the pool. Something like that. So there is a cardinal series of points. There's an ordinal series of powers, lines of development, and these two are resolved in a proportional ratio by a third. And the third is a transformational grammar that acts as a plane. So in terms of symbols, you have the ordering of series of not things, but the ultimate constituents of things. Quarks, points, moments. In in classical Abhidhamma development of Buddhist logic, the length of a psychic moment is 1/75,225th of a second. And that if you're really good enough Yogacara meditator, you can resolve a second of your mental attention into one of those 75,225th moments, and that below that no registry occurs in time-space. Of course, this is many powers below the threshold of what is analyzable by the senses. The perception of attention is about 10 thousandths of a second. If you go below 10 thousandths of a second, there's no way that sense perception can detect a difference. And so you have to supercharge yourself in meditation to be able to resolve that fine. You can resolve that fine if you need to. You're not limited by the spec list from nature. But no one needs to be that refined. There are just a few men and women who needed to be that refined to find out for the rest of us, is this true? And they have come back unanimously, yes, this is true. That below the threshold of the quark, of the point, of the spark of God, below that threshold, nothing whatsoever registers in time-space electromagnetic energy. That there are other aspects of reality that are there, be assured that they are there. But in terms of our time-space, our electromagnetic energy, they do not occur in any manifest way. They do not effectively determine the gestalts, the pacing, the structure. They do not affect space and time. They come into play in completely different ways. So that the symbol has cardinal point alignments and ordinal lines of relationality brought together. The points and lines are brought together in terms of a resolving plane, and that plane, in terms of our psychic energy, is very often the aspect of language which we would call, which has been called, a transformational grammar. In other words, a grammar is a structure of how one can say something meaningful and the variance and keep the meaning. A transformational grammar is how to say something out of one form into another form. How do you say something out of a cardinal point alignment into a lined ratio? And the points and the lines come together. They're resolved by a mutually resolving plane. This plane, and now you can understand Kandinsky's book, From Point to Line to Plane. And there's one little provision here. You should understand that even Euclid 2,300 years ago in Alexandria already saw the point as a locus of no dimension. You don't have to go into modern metaphysics. 2,300 years ago, already the resolving power of the human mind was to see that a point is a locus of no dimension. It is only there when we use it. If we do not use it, it's not there. When a point moves, its movement makes a line. You're told in sophomoric high school geometry that a line connects 2 points. Well, now you have 2 points, 2 locuses of no dimension. What are you going to connect? Whereas the original Euclid was very rational, and rational meaning Pythagorean, when a locus of no dimension is there because you're attending to it, your attention to it makes it manifest. And when that moves, that movement is a line. And that line, once established, generates a possibility of a plane. When you get to the plane, to the level of plane, from point to line to plane, then you have the possibility of geometry. Then you have geometry. If you're only at the level of points, and you're only at the level of lines, if you're only dealing with cardinal series and ordinal powers, those are arithmetic operations. Whereas as soon as you get to the resolving third of a plane, then you move from arithmetic into geometry. Once we get to geometry, once we get to a plane, there is another possibility that is available, but it takes a projection in order to establish itself. The projection is the movement from geometry to trigonometry, from a plane to a sphere. And the quality that is added that makes it possible to go from a plane to a sphere is the addition of a dimension of periodicity. If you add time to planes, then they can become spheres. Pythagoras never talked about the music of the planes, but he always mentioned the music of the spheres. Why? Because you cannot have music without periodicity, without time. There has to be a time signature, or there's no music. Even in Schoenberg's 12-tone, there still has to be a periodicity. There still has to be a time signature. As soon as time is added to geometry, then you have a realm of musical spheres. So that a human psyche that is trained in integration carefully from the cardinal points of attentiveness to the lines of relationality to the planes of purpose, then their psyche can entertain the sphere of wholeness for the first time in actuality. Not in imagination, not in hopefulness, not in some future mutant, not in aliens coming down and little whistling hovercraft, but in living men and women who suddenly get it because they are it, because their psychic energy for the first time becomes a well-rounded world. And the universal symbol for that was always that there was this thought bubble over the heads of the saints. You can see a number of thousands of illustrations of this. People who have got it suddenly have this thought bubble. They're the spacemen. They're the space women. Those are those space suits. Consciousness is the best space suit in the universe. You can go anywhere with it. So that this sphericality, which includes time, is a fourth-dimensional projection, whereas trigonometry is at its best a three-dimensional projection. Geometry as a three-dimensional projection, so that cycles in geometry are always circular and they're always diagrammatic. So if you ask somebody to explain to them how the universe works, or how people work, or how reality works, and you see them start to draw little diagrams, they're stuck on the plane level of psychic development. It doesn't matter how complex the diagrams are. It makes no difference whatsoever. They have not made the transformation to that fullness, that trigonometric quality. Because while a geometric cycle is always circular and diagrammatic within a plane, a trigonometric cycle is always dynamic and energetic within a periodicity. Trigonometric cycles always energize time. That's how you can tell. Somebody has that spark of reality because they're living in a four-dimensional continuum right now. They're alive. They're not just diagrams. Now, there are a lot of egotistical con men gurus who project a mask of liveliness. Just catch them in off hours, and you'll see. It's just a mask. You can look behind it, and you can see where the little eyelets fit in. The wire is across. They're phonies. They're playing cultural games. They're just mythic enactments of a ritual-based understanding and comportment. There's no symbolic transformation whatsoever. And consequently, there's no consciousness, and there's no real time. There's no temporality. So that spheres are cycles. Notice the plural here, at least two or more. Spheres are cycles intersecting and interacting in periodicities, in time. These cycles are mutually conditioning, and if there is not a synthesizing symbol in at least one of these cycles, then the cycle that reflects the strongest conditioning from whatever source will take over and will index the integration and will control the periodicity in the sphere and whatever it is. That's why one of the #1 concerns in any kind of religious authority is to ensure that its calendar is enforced. These are our holidays. This is how we count time. This is what this month is, etc. This is what this year is. Because the calendar is that periodicity which is wrapped around their synthesizing symbol, and that cycle then will take over. And it doesn't matter then. Whatever education you give to someone, they will factor whatever you give them into this synthesizing symbol-controlled cycle. As my friend Dr. Heller says, such people are uneducable. It's not that they can't learn, but they always learn in the way they were taught. You can be the best teacher, you can give nothing but solid cream for years on end. They don't change. They just get dug in more and more. There's no transformation in that whatsoever. The only way out of that impasse is to help someone find for themselves at least a provisional synthesizing symbol that will work for them at least long enough until they can get to a position where they can choose a better one. So a real education at its very beginning encourages the person, the individual, that man, that woman, encourages that individual to bring out of themselves the seeds, the beginnings of their own synthesizing symbol, so that when you get to the educational place where we are now, they have something that they can draw upon which is of themselves, has nothing to do with whatever authority was glommed onto them for whatever purposes. Maybe it was for good purpose. Who cares? If it was for good purpose, you can later go on and do all the accepting and integrating whatever. You can have whatever religion, whatever politics you want to have. The kind of education that is being offered here is like Jefferson and Yates. You should have the right to know what you're choosing. You should have the right to see what's on the table, what you're going to eat, before you're forced to eat it. That's all I'm saying. You have total freedom. And that this education in no way preconditions you to any kind of religious or political or even psychological predilection. other than that you have the opportunity to review before you choose to integrate something, to see what it is, whether you like it or not, even on that level, whether you really want it or not. So that if there is a synthesizing symbol, where is it going to come from? If it comes from you individually and not from any kind of cultural conditioning, not from any kind of previous education, where are we going to find it? We found it by you making two masks. By you taking, thanks to Roland, by you taking a banana and making a mask of this banana, of this food, and then making a second mask of some feeling, a food that goes in, a feeling that comes out, and putting those two masks together in an actual ceremony that you do. It doesn't have to be very well done. All it has to do to have efficacy is that it would have had to be used at least once. The making of the ceremony one time anneals these two masks together because they've been used together. Reality is a very mysterious thing. Once you do something, really, it's there. And you can work with it as a psychic seed. And if you're a really good gardener, mystical gardener, you can take any psychic seed, and out of that you can grow a whole universe. Anyone. This seed of the two masks annealed together by use in a ceremony, that interface, that point, that spot, is the first seed of the synthesizing symbol. So now your masks, your two masks, whatever they were, are a source for you at this time to go back in retrospect and take a look and try to find the deeper meaning, the deeper significance of those two masks together. That those two masks form, notice now we're talking transformational grammar, those two masks form a polarity, inner, outer. And if that polarity is turned 90 degrees, instead of a polarity, they become a complementarity. It's like this. Here's a polarity. These two hands, all they can do is do that. If it's turned 90 degrees, then you can do that. It's a visual. It's a little mudra. This is a polarity. This is a complementarity. So that one of the universal expressions symbolically, by using human hands, of a complementational whole is prayer. Savvy? There's meaning behind all of these things. Once that is done, that synthesizing symbol will grow all of its own. It has psychic energy on the symbolic level has autonomous growth capacities. But its autonomy will be respectful for your individuality. It will constantly, at every development, consult you in terms of dreams, in terms of insights, in terms of predilections, in terms of thoughts. You'll see things. Your attention will be drawn to something, synchronicities, whatever it is. It will always consult you. It will never automatically go to a higher level of power without including your assent to go along with it. This makes integration individuation. This makes integration individual. So that it is you who is now integrating and not just some variant of the religion, of the politics, or whatever the social conditioning might be. So that when you come in this integration to a point of realization, it will be in you that the realization happens. And it's absolutely important that the realization happens in you. That center be in you. Because that center, realization, is the seed of the person. But in a different process, instead of like the mask being the seed of the integrated self, the realized self is the seed of the differentiated person. They work like that, like breathing in and breathing out. The mask begins the breathing in to the point to where you're full inside. And if you are, and you consciously breathe out, that breathing out begins the person. Mask, symbol, person. Mask, symbol, person. Ritual, symbol, art. So that symbols are a fulcrum in between the ritual mask and the artistic person. Any human being who ever comes into a conscious differentiation of himself is an artist. It doesn't matter whether they can express themselves in another medium or not. They express themselves in reality. Spiritual persons are always artists. Always. That's why it's always called the art of living. Even Mahesh Maharaji, talking to the Beatles, said, boys, it's the art of living and the science of being. It's like that. Now, we don't have to get to the science for a while. So, if we have a geometric cycle which is circular and diagrammatic on a plane, if we have a transformational grammar, which is the development of the mask to the symbol, mask and symbol, then we have a trigonometric transformation that takes place, and we have cycles which have periodicity. We have energetic time. One of the great Gurdjieffian doctors in Britain, Maurice Nicole, who wrote a 5-volume commentary on Gurdjieff, wrote a book on esoteric Egyptian Hermetic wisdom called Living Time. And the symbol for it was the infinity sign done over and over and over and over again, vertically, so that one lives infinity at every moment. And one can live on that level. We have no limitations whatsoever in terms of the projected capacity of our spirituality. There are no limits whatsoever. God has made us like He is. Absolutely free. Let's review once more and then take a break. Integration at a certain point will reach a natural limbo. It will not go any further on its own. It needs then to consult something to go further. If you don't provide it with something of yourself, it will choose something from instinct or conditioning. And largely that selection is from the nominations that the ego puts forth. In which case you get an inflated ego and not an integrated self. Because instead of integration going further and condensing further to a point of realization, a point of no location, of no dimension, it gets into a regressive mode where it seems like it's integrating, and what it is it's feeding and fattening out the ego. And the ego says, oh, we're doing really well, we're really integrating. We're including all these other people. What a wonderful sphere of activity we have. Well, how many more can we get going? It's like that. That's what's an illusion. This whole process, whether it goes further into integration or whether it reflects back into the world, that liminality, to use the correct term for it, that liminality, that outline of limits, is a phenomenon in the mind known in Greek, I mentioned it last night, as ikonikos, the mirror surface. And what's behind the mirrored mind is the icon of the ego, promoting its own importance. But the ego is at home in a mythic, cultural domain, not at all in a symbolic interior, and not at all in consciousness. The ego fears and hates consciousness. Bertrand Russell wrote in Nightmares of Famous Persons, "Man fears thought like the plague, because real thought is wild and it will go where it can go. And there's no way the ego can control it. And the ego loves to have things controlled." So we're at the point now in our education where it's important for you to look back at your two masks, at the meaning, the deeper meaning of those two masks. Two stages. First is a polarity, inner and outer, and then rotate them 90 degrees. Change your perspective. Don't see it as inner and outer, but see it as relational. And that will be the beginning of developing a transformational grammar to take the plane into the sphere. And you'll notice right away, because there'll be an emotional difference. Instead of wanting to get things correct in terms of mental diagrams, you will find that your insight is charged. And a charged insight is energized periodicity coming into play. You'll be able to look at something and it will tell you instantly some possibilities. It's like in the wonderful stage of Hiawatha, where when he needs to go into inner development, he goes to the trees and they tell him what they're good for. He goes to the plants, they tell him what they're good for. The animals, they tell him what they're good for, and he makes the choice so that his symbolic journey can develop. Let's take a break there. Let's come to Yates. When Yates was 22 years old, his qualities as a poet were already beginning to manifest, but at the same time, his psychic capacities had already been brought into play as a teenager. And so when his early poems were written, he in a way tried to write artistically above and over his, shall we say, occult energies. And as he did this, a kind of a discrepancy crept in. And by the time he was in his early 30s, there was an intrusion from the deeper occult aspects of Yates into his poetry, into his mask as a poet. The first indication of this was in a series of 2 volumes of short stories that he wrote. And the short story I'm going to review just in passing here is called Rosa Alchemica, The Alchemical Rose, and it was published in 1897. And the very first couple of lines in Rosa Alchemica are, "It is now more than 10 years since I met for the last time Michael Robartes, and for the first time and the last time his friends and fellow students, and witnessed his and their tragic end, and passed through strange experiences which have changed me so that my writings have grown less popular and less intelligible, and may compel me to take refuge in the habit of St. Dominic, become a Dominican monk. I had just published Rosa Alchemical, a little work on the alchemist, somewhat in the manner of Sir Thomas Browne, and received many letters from believers in the arcane sciences, upbraiding what they called my timidity, for they could not believe so evident sympathy, but the sympathy of the artist, which is half pity for everything which has moved men's hearts in any age. I had discovered early in my researches that their doctrine was no merely chemical fantasy, but a philosophy they applied to the world, to the elements, and to man himself, and that they sought to fashion gold out of common metals merely as part of a universal transmutation of all things into some divine and imperishable substance. And this enabled me to make my little book a fanciful reverie over the transmutation of life into art, and a cry of measureless desire for a world made holy of essences. So by 1897, Yates already had a figure active in his psyche named Michael Robartes. Now we're going to take Yates's A Vision, which was published quite a few years later. It was first published in 1938, so this is more than 40 years later. And one of the central figures in A Vision is that Michael Robartes appears in the automatic writing of Yates's wife, not in Yates himself. So we have major mystery on our hands. How does a literary figure in some young writer reappear in his wife's deepest automatic writing vision 40 years later? How does that happen? We need to learn just a little bit about Yates, just a smidgen about Yates as a teenager, to begin to understand what has happened here. On the mother's side of Yates, the family was the Pollexfens, and there was in Sligo, a house that had several levels, and on the top was a little lookout where his grandfather, William Pollexfen, could stand and look out into Sligo Bay and see his ships, and the young Willie Yates, his favorite place for reverie was up there in that lookout. Later on, when Yates was to find a home, he chose a medieval Irish castle, Thorballaley, that had a tower, which he sought constantly to put together, to redo. He lived in a little cottage at the foot of the tower, and the tower had 3 stories. And in his lifetime, he managed to get the first 2 stories finished, but he never quite finished the 3rd story. The first story was the library, the second story was the bedroom, and the 3rd story was the, quote, ladies' room for his wife. And it never managed to quite get finished. Now, what's interesting about this is that Yates got used to deep reveries of long vision, standing in this, what would be in New England, I used to call the widow's walk, up on top of the house. I had a big 3-story house in Canada, and on what would be the 4th floor on the roof was a widow's walk, and you could look forever across the prairie. And there is a quality in that perspective where you literally begin to see that the Earth's surface is like a diagram, but that the Earth's surface is very minute part of reality when you take the sky into consideration. So that the geometric plane seems very large until you begin to bring the spherical, celestial qualities into play. As an adolescent, his maternal relatives were always trying to elicit out of Yates psychic qualities. In fact, with one of his uncles, he used to practice telepathy. The uncle would walk on top of a ridge, and little Willie, adolescent, would walk on the bottom of the ridge, and they would send each other telepathic messages until Yates got good enough to be able to have conversations with his uncle telepathically. Yates is really somebody special. By the time Yates was 16, he just assumed that this was a natural quality which people had if they would just develop it. All of this was let go when his ambitions to be an artist, he's going to be a famous writer, he's going to deal with art and not with these adolescent games, that the occult energies were something that parlor stuff that you got into, and he let it go. And he devoted himself to refining his art. He took to being what the Brits at that time would call an aesthete. He dressed in meticulous clothes, way too old for himself. He developed a little stoop, which was fashionable in the salon society of the time, and glasses that would ride down on the nose a little bit so that he could sort of lean over and look at things that were shown to you, to see what they were. And all of these qualities, he became a salon creature. And he began to rise in this world of the salon writer of the British Empire, and he took an apartment in London, which he kept for 24 years in the Woburn building. Yates ignored his deep psychic capacity for a long time. And then when Yates got married, finally, late in his life, he married a woman named Georgie, and he called her George. And Georgie was extremely affine to Yates's intuitive, psychic, deep layers. They were married October 20th, 1917. And to sort of celebrate this, the artist in Yates wanted to bring out a new volume of poems. And so he brought out a volume which has become one of the great little thin volumes of poems in the 20th century, The Wild Swans at Culé. And the last poem in the Wild Swans at Culé collection is a poem which bears the curious title, The Double Vision of Michael Robartes. Published 1919, 22 years after the beginning of the dismissal of this psychic character, he comes back. This poem is the prototype. It's the seed out of which a vision grows. Here's how the poem reads at its beginning. This is 1919. A Vision was published in 1938. On the grey rock of Cashel, the mind's eye has called up the cold spirits that are born when the old boon is vanished from the sky and the new still hides her horn. Under blank eyes and fingers never still, the particular is pounded till it is man. When had I my own will? Oh, not since life began. Constrained, arraigned, baffled, bent, and unbent by these wire-jointed jaws and limbs of wood, themselves obedient, knowing not evil and good, obedient to some magical breath. They do not even feel, so abstract are they, so dead beyond our death, triumph that we obey. On the grey rock of Cashel I suddenly saw a sphinx with woman's breast and lion paw, a Buddha hand at rest, hand lifted up that blessed, and right between these two a girl at play, that, it may be, had danced her life away, for now being dead it seemed that she of dancing dreamed. So you begin to see the tone of this poem. The Wild Swans at Cooley in 1919, the last poem, the double vision of Michael Robartes, triggered in Yates this tremendous of imagery, so that 2 years later, just 2 years later, he published a whole collection of poems entitled Michael Robartes and the Dancer. And in Michael Robartes and the Dancer is the greatest of all Yates's poems. Right in the very center of this comes an apocalyptic visionary poem which has been held to be the greatest poem of the 20th century. It's called The Second Coming. And I'll read it for you just so you have that in your experience. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiriti Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? All this has to do with the vision as the culmination. Notice that in 1897, he's writing some volumes of short stories. He was very proud of them. He went to famous writers like Robert Bridges, whose poetry is diametrically opposed to Yates, but who was a man Yates really respected. And Bridges wrote him back that this collection shows fantastic promise because it has a living rhetoric to the English language in the short story form that hasn't been seen for quite a long time. That, in fact, it reminded Bridges of the great French short story writers, de Maupassant and Flaubert and so forth. One of the creative figures out of his so-called imagination, Michael Robartes, comes into play as a literary figure, and then 22 years later, in writing a volume of poems to commemorate his wife and their marriage and their life together, and their move out of London, out of an apartment that he'd been in for 24 years, to this castle in the west of Ireland, Thorballilee, and trying to get it together, trying to redo it. And the volume of poems that comes out, The Wild Swans at Cooley, has a last poem, The Double Vision of Michael Robartes. He makes a sudden reappearance in the poet's art. And 2 years later, a whole volume of poems about this figure, and at the very center of it, this great apocalyptic poem, The Second Coming. Seven years after that, Yates published what was his most famous volume of poems, called, after his home, The Tower. The Tower. Notice that for him, the tower is a symbol of lifting oneself off the plane, off the geometric quality of the symbolic psyche, into the geometry, the energized time of the fullness of the celestial energy of our psyche. So that in the next volume of poems, The Tower, the very first lead-off poem is called Sailing to Byzantium, which is all about occult time, which energizes the whole cycles of the movement of civilization. Civilization seen as a sphere with many different cycles, and that the controlling synthesizing symbol in the cycle that controls the whole sphere of civilization comes through in this poem. Let me make it visual for you. 3 thin volumes of poems. The last poem in the first one cited, The Wild Swans at Cooley, is about Michael Robartes. The second, a whole collection about Michael Robartes, the central apocalyptic poem being The Second Coming, and then The Tower, the first poem of which is Sailing to Byzantium. The last poem of the first collection, the whole second collection, and the first poem of the third collection. From 1917, when he was married, to 1928, when The Tower came out, in that 10, 11-year period, Yates was burning white hot and became the greatest poet of the 20th century. Because he was able to allow a whole titanic volcano of occult capacity to explode into his artistic language. And the language was creative enough, it moved fast enough to take this volcano of occult explosion into it. And a vision is an example of one of the rarest things there is in history, of a great magician who is also a great artist. Carl Jung is a great magician. He's not a great artist. You can see how rare it is. You almost never see it. Merlin was a great magician. He was not an artist at all. To have a great magician who is at the same time a great artist is one of the rarest of all human beings. Here's Sailing to Byzantium. See if you can pick out now the synthesizing symbol that comes out of the energized time sequence that Michael Robartes as a figure has brought into play. Because it's the Michael Robartes cycle that will be the major cycle in Yates' sphere of civilization. Here's the poem. It's in 4 sections. Notice the quaternary, 4 sections. Section 1. That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl commend all summer long what is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying, monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed over the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past, or passing, or to come. You can see that the impingement of occult energy into an artistic language produces a kind of apocalyptic prophetic quality to the forms. In fact, we call that literary form of esoteric, impinged literary form, we call that apocalyptic. Sailing to Byzantium, The Second Coming, the double vision of Michael Robartes are miniature apocalypses, but they are still poems. It is a rare, rare thing. It's like a personality which has learned an artistic medium, like poetry in this case, but is completely inundated by an occult lava that swirls up. It's like the whole ocean of the so-called unconscious suddenly covers. Suddenly one is deluged by this disorienting. The only way in which there can be an island of poetic form that sustains itself in this oceanic covering is for there to be a dynamic, moving, synthesizing symbol that keeps this together. It's rather like the way that the Hawaiian Islands continue to move in a geologic tectonic plate over a single spot in the Earth's mantle that keeps upwelling. And 2,000 miles of Hawaiian Islands index the great geologic ages that landforms have continuously not only stayed born out of the ocean, but have moved on, and so they stretch like an archipelago. Yates's poems, from The Wild Swans at Cooley to The Tower, and those three collections are like a poetic archipelago that has survived an inundation of occult volcanic energy. So that by 1928, Yates was born in 1865, so that's 35, and 28 is, what, 53, 54 years old? By the time he was 54 years old, Yates wanted to know, he had a right to know, is there any kind of way that one could take one's poetic genius for form and see the pattern of the lava ocean of the occult world? Not the cosmos of scientific consciousness, but is there a pattern to the ocean of what is called the unconscious? He used his wife's automatic writings as the transformational grammar to go into that realm, and what he came out with is a vision. And he literally teased out a tremendous vision that the occult lava underneath the psyche of all human beings arrange themselves in such a way on this particular planet that they modulate their periodicity in terms of the moon. That the phases of the moon, both the waxing and the waning moon, get it? Integration and differentiation. The waxing and waning of the moon, in those phases, one can detect the hidden occult patterns beneath the psyche, and that they can be understood as a form. And that's what a vision is. A vision is the development of this particular form. Just to begin here, where Yates begins a vision. I guess maybe you don't know, Yates was always considered from youth to be one of the most promising poets in the world, and he was friends with many other great poets. And one of his closest friends was Ezra Pound. So that he makes, at the very beginning of a vision, a little dedication, a packet for Ezra Pound, who did not like the idea of occult things at all. Pound was born in Ketchum, Idaho, and he was a toughie. He was a salon giant who couldn't stand to be in salons. And he was the one who prided himself that he was able to raise a whole generation of geniuses from being salon effetes to being the kinds of poets who could initiate a whole new scale of civilization. This was his pet project. For instance, he was the one who went around with a petition to get funds to get T.S. Eliot out of working for the bank. He should not be working in a bank. He should be writing poetry. And so while he was doing that, he was encouraging Eliot to step way outside of his previous capacities and to write The Wasteland. Why write sweet little poems like J. Alfred Prufrock's Love Song when you could write the greatest epic poem, short though it is, still an epic poem, of the 20th century? And so Pound was always interested in these grandiose, large things for cultural reasons, and he always scoffed at things like psychic energy. So Yates puts in the front of a vision, because he had already done it, a packet for Ezra Pound. It's a Dear Ezra letter.
It's a Dear Ezra letter.
And it begins with Rapallo. Rapallo is in Italy, and it's a place that Ezra Pound loved to go for vacations, and in fact lived there for quite a long time. Mountains that shelter the bay from all but the south wind. Bare, brown branches of low vines and of tall trees blurring their outline as though with a soft mist. Houses mirrored in an almost motionless sea. A verandaed gable a couple of miles away bringing to mind some Chinese painting. Apollo's thin line of broken mother of pearl along the water's edge, the little town described in the Ode on a Grecian Urn. In what better place could I, forbidden Dublin's winters, and all excited, crowded places, spend what winters yet remain? On the broad pavement by the sea pass Italian peasants or working people, people out of the little shops, a famous German dramatist, the barber's brother looking like an Oxford Don, a British retired skipper, an Italian prince descended from Charlemagne and no richer than the rest of us, a few tourists seeking tranquility. As there is no great harbor full of yachts, no great yellow strand, no great ballroom, no great casino, the rich carry elsewhere their strenuous lives. I shall not lack conversation. Ezra Pound, whose art is the opposite of mine, whose criticism commends what I most condemn, a man with whom I should quarrel more than anyone else if we were not united by affection, has for years lived in rooms opening onto a flat roof by the sea. Notice how he begins a vision. It's almost an artistic short story, a setting very quiet in an out-of-the-way, tranquil place out in the countryside of Italy. Notice the artist in Yates dominating the magical energy of a vision. There's no trace in 1938 of apocalyptic poetry just seething to the forefront. What has come back in is that complete command not only of the language, but of the man and of the occult energy. Yates, even more than Jung, is the greatest magician of the 20th century. He was, incidentally, the head of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn for many years. He's the one who threw Aleister Crowley out of the Golden Dawn Order. He said wisdom schools are not reform schools. You'll have to go somewhere else to misbehave. Yates was on a level where he could just dismiss somebody like Crowley, who was dismissible. A vision is the most powerful occult pattern in the 20th century. But what is curious about it, it is a complete bringing back into play the most ancient of all the occult patterns from old Hermetic Egypt. Thoth in ancient Egypt was the god of the moon, associated with the moon and the phases of the moon. And the earliest quality of magic was not to do with the sun, but to do with the moon. It took a long time for human beings to understand the patterns of the sun. No one understood the patterns and the periodicity of the sun until 1608 AD, whereas the phases of the moon were understood at least 40,000 years ago. The first person to understand the phases of the sun was a man named Kepler, who published a book called The New Astronomy in 1608, and he was the first one to understand that the sun and the earth mutually, in a complementation, revolve around a mutual center, which is no place at all, but is in fact the synthesizing force of the whole gravitational star system. We call it today the barycenter, and that the sun and the earth mutually revolve around that center, that point of no dimension. And the sun, because it's so much more massive, is much more close to it, and the earth, because it's so small, is quite far from it. But nevertheless, the barycenter is not the sun, but is the gravitational focus of the complementation of the two. Kepler was the first to understand that. But the phases of the moon were understood in Paleolithic times. In fact, all megalithic architecture is based upon calculations of alignments that factor into moon phases. And Sligo, in the west of Ireland, is the place where there are the most megalithic monuments of any place on the earth. 2 miles outside of Sligo is a great 2-acre earthenworks that's very much a model like the corral that's outside Avebury in the Wiltshire Plain. But north and south of Sligo, for dozens of miles, there are huge megalithic monuments and tombs extending for about 40 miles along that coast. So that where Yates was born, where he grew up, is the center of the old megalithic occult center of understanding how the patterns of life on this world are indexed by the movements of our closest world, the moon. And in a way, Yates' vision is the 72-year-old man reaching back and pulling back out of his archetypal origins the very pattern that symbolically makes sense of it all. The prism out of which he pulled it was not his own psyche, but his wife's psyche. Next week when we take a look at it, try and get yourself a copy of Yates' A Vision. It's out in paperback. And try to read far enough in it so that you can begin to get the character of the relationship between Yates and his wife. Understanding just this one provision, Yates for years, for decades, was in love with a woman who did not return his love, a woman named Maud Gonne. A large, buxom, active, politically active woman who spurned him constantly. She was his friend. She would not be his lady. And only when it was completely beyond hope, she had married someone else, she had had a daughter, Yates even for a while became infatuated with her daughter to try in that way to get close. When it became obvious completely that she was not the complement to him, he discovered in Georgie, in his wife, the perfect complement to himself, which allowed him to have that kind of balance of the true self, that center of gravity, to where even the magma ocean of the unconscious was ordered. This is one of the highest qualities of love. Love is so powerful in its orientation that even hell can be mapped exactly by it. Now I want to bring in Jefferson just briefly, because Jefferson and Yates come together. They work together. As significant as all this is just a part of our education. It's just part of the field of inquiry. We have just a few minutes, so let me just give you the notes raw. Jefferson's Bible, his Bible, chose Jesus as the synthesizing symbol for the New Testament. And that the New Testament then was the controlling cycle, in his estimation, for the sphere that was generated by Western civilization. Jesus, the man, not Christ, the God. New Testament wisdom, not biblical authority. New world freedom, not old world doctrine. Principles for living men, not codes from dead men. So that when Jefferson made his little Bible, made Jesus the synthesizing symbol of the New Testament cycle, of the sphere of Western civilization, his audience was not a poetic audience, not a readership that was out there. Jefferson paid for all the copies himself and distributed them free to all the members of Congress. Because when he became president in 1800, he understood something that only FDR has understood in American politics. You can't get anything done without them going along with it. And you have to let them see what you're working on and what the methodological principle is. They will still argue pro and con, but at least they will understand what you're trying to do. And so Jefferson, by making the Jefferson Bible and handing it to members of Congress, everybody in both houses got a copy, personally handed to them by Jefferson. He was criticized by the popular press as being the devil's own. Look at Jefferson with horns and devil's tail and pitchfork. He's mucking around with our monarchy. And Jefferson's reply is, yes, I am. Because the United States is not going to be a monarchy. It's going to be a democratic republic where the people decide what values they're going to have. And so we need to have man at the center. God's already at the center in heaven. Man at the center. And we need a new world freedom, not old world doctrine. We need to have a wisdom, not an authority. And you have to understand that in 1800, using the Bible as authority was standard procedure. Anything you said, somebody would look up a quote and quote you that quote at you and not pay any attention to what you said. Half of the libraries in Europe were filled with theological arguments bound up in tomes. The first library at Harvard University was about 95% theology books. Jefferson was a radical revolution in this. Jefferson's library was about 6,000 volumes. It was the first library in the world that shunted theology to one category among dozens and dozens of categories, and the proportion of books on theology in Jefferson's library were in proportion to all the other subjects that the library was composed of. And then to make sure that Congress, which received the synthesizing symbol, got a field of inquiry that matched it, Jefferson sold his library to become the original Library of Congress. So literally, Jefferson knew how to play cards. He stacked not only the deck, but the players. And that's why the United States in 1800 is completely radically different from the United States in 1799. In 1799, it was a de facto monarchy. And in 1801, it was a continental free-for-all. More next week.